everyone. So for today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the First World War. This conflict began in August of 1914 and lasted 4 long years until November of 1918. For those involved, it was known as the Great War. It was a massive conflict that had dire consequences and huge historic significance on the entire world. It was known as the Great War until the Second World War. And for many of those involved, too, it was seen as the war to end all wars. It was such a horrific, long, devastating conflict that people believed that this would end war going forward. So the Great War really was a world war with global consequences. It began as a European conflict, but it spread throughout the world. You can see the map here. The green are the Allied powers, and the orange are the Central powers. So you see most of the world is involved in this conflict, and this will have consequences throughout the century. The 1800s had really been an age of peace and prosperity through most of the world. There hadn't been a major conflict in Europe. European powers had spread throughout the world, had spread capitalism, imperialism, economic growth. The United States had grown massively. So this war really changed a lot of that and really changed the trajectory of the 20th century. So maybe the most horrific aspect of this war was just the massive casualties that were inflicted as a result. There were 38 million casualties. In 4 years, 11 million were dead and 17 million were wounded. But maybe the most devastating aspect of World War I was that it was not the war to end all wars. It actually directly led to the conflict in the Second World War, which is an even more devastating conflict. So Germany was devastated by World War I. They lost 65% of the troops were either killed or wounded. They experienced severe economic decline following the war. They experienced a political fracture. Their system of government was overthrown and replaced. And they experienced public humiliation as a result of losing the war. Germans would eventually turn to Adolf Hitler to restore their strength and pride, and that would lead to World War II. You can see a depiction here of children stacking money in post-war Germany because of hyperinflation. Their money was worth nothing. Japan was also changed because of the First World War. Japan had fought with the Allies. They had requested land concessions following the war, and this request was rejected by the European powers, by the Americans. And as a result, the Japanese turned towards militarism and imperialism, and this would lead directly to the Second World War. The Allied powers of France and Great Britain had been so devastated by the war that they became pacifists after the war. They didn't want to fight another conflict. So throughout the 1920s and 1930s, they yielded to Hitler, hoping to avoid another conflict. And this encouraged Hitler to pursue war as a goal. He saw it as a means to an end. World War I changed the US's role throughout the world. The US became a global player. It really became a military power beyond its own borders, more than it ever had been. It intervened in European affairs. It had stayed out of European affairs before, and it was seen as the savior for the Allied powers in World War I. And this would last. This lasts up until today, where America is the dominant military power in the world. The Soviet Union was also born out of the ashes of the First World War. As a result of the war, the people uprose against the Tsar in 1917, and the Tsarist regime was overthrown in Russia. Following this, Vladimir Lenin and communists seized power and established the Soviet Union, which would last until 1991. New countries were formed as a result of the war. Colonial empires disintegrated due to the conflict, as we saw the Russian Empire dissolved, the German Empire dissolved as well as the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. These all central powers, their leaders lost their power, and their countries and empires fell apart. In the ashes, countries around the world began to proclaim their independence, and this triggers instability and conflict in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Let's examine how the war began and how all of this occurred. So the war begins in August of 1914. So this great conflict actually begins due to a small event. In June of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated by a member of the Black Hand terrorist organization. So the assassination of the Archduke is really bizarre, but true how it happened. 7 terrorists from the Black Hand organization were armed with bombs and guns, waiting for the Archduke, who was in a motorcade going through the city of Sarajevo. Um, Nedeljko Kabrinovic lobbed a grenade at the Archduke's car. Um, it didn't explode the car, but the car actually changed directions as a result of that. Gaviero Princip was on the corner, one of the terrorists, and the Archduke's vehicle basically pulled up right in front of him. Princip pulled out a gun and assassinated the Archduke. So Princip was actually a Serbian national, and he had been trained and equipped by the Serbian government. Um, Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been in conflict, not direct conflict, but this assassination was a result of that conflict. So these two powers, Austro-Hungarian Empire, prepares for war against Serbia as a result of this assassination. But these countries also have alliances in Europe to defend each other. So basically, countries saying, I've got your back if something happens. And one of these countries is Russia backs Serbia. Russia commits to going to war if Austro-Hungarian Empire attacks Serbia. So Russia begins to mobilize its 6 million man army because it looks like there is going to be a conflict. Germany, however, backs the Austro-Hungarian Empire and warns Russia that this will lead to war, that Germany will get involved as well. So what happens is really the assassination of Franz Ferdinand begins a domino effect as these alliances that the European powers have made fall into place. Um, what happens is it's the Triple Entente versus the Triple Alliance, the Central Powers. The Triple Entente is Great Britain, France, and Russia. And the Triple Alliance is Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. You can see that depiction here. So as Russia says it's going to back Serbia, Germany says it's going to back Austria-Hungary. Um, the British and the France say, hey, we back Russia, so if you go to war with them, and the other powers, the Triple Alliance says, well, then we're going to go to war with you. That's what happens in 1914. What that means is Germany is really geographically cursed for where it sits. You can see that in the map there. It is stuck in the center of Europe, squeezed in between Russia and France. Its two enemies due to the alliances. It cannot afford to wait and see if the enemies will attack because they will quickly be overrun. It cannot defend itself on both fronts. So due to this situation, Germany is forced to act. Um, they had actually been preparing for war. There was plans in place. And so what they did was invade neutral Belgium. Belgium was seen as a scrap of paper, easily is going to fall. They were going to go through Belgium, cut down through France, and the Germans believed that they could defeat France in just 6 weeks. Um, and then, so that's what's known as the Western Front. They attack France. Then in the east, they attack Russia as well. So they're preparing on both sides for war. They are preempting the attack from the Allies. However, that didn't happen. What happens is that all the armies get bogged down in the area of Belgium, Luxembourg, and France on the Western Front, and then on the Eastern Front, due to industrial warfare. Warfare has changed dramatically. They're still using tactics that we would have seen in the Revolutionary War, in the Civil War, but the way that the technology has advanced, industry has built up massive weaponry that will force these armies to stop and dig in. One of the main inventions that caused the stalemate was the machine gun. You see machine gunners here. They're able to shoot massive amounts of ammunition very quickly. So you can no longer have these armies marching directly at each other. They simply get mowed down by gunfire. Barbed wire was spread all over the fronts. And this stops marching armies from coming at each other too. You can see this. You can see the amount of barbed wire there on the left. And you can see a man caught in barbed wire after he's died. You can't march in that. You get caught. Heavy artillery on the left meant that armies could hit each other from miles and miles away. So a bunch of men lined up marching could be hit from 5 miles away with heavy artillery, killing them. And then tanks were invented during the First World War to try to break the stalemate. One of the most horrific aspects of the First World War was the invention of chemical warfare, of gas to try to break the stalemate. You can see that here with the picture of men running through gas. And you can also see that here with men wearing gas masks to protect them from gas attacks. So this is a really horrific aspect of this warfare. So on both fronts, the armies dig in, and it's a stalemate. It's a stalemate in the trenches. Both sides dig in, and they're unable to break through either side because of the industrial warfare, because of the nature of the trench warfare. Neither side is able to make a huge advance, so they're stuck in this warfare for years. You can simply see some of the depictions of life in the trenches here. The men reading, writing. You can see a soldier peeking out. These trenches ran for miles and miles along the fronts. And this is what war really looked like for years upon years. Again, depictions of trench warfare, of men in trenches. Those are German soldiers on the left there with a machine gun. Those are British soldiers on the right. You can see the horrific conditions, the standing water there on the right. These trenches were filled with disease, with rats, with death. Just a horrific situation occurred in Europe as a result of this war. So as all of this is happening in Europe from 1914 to 1916, men are dying, they're stuck in the trenches, nothing is happening. The United States declares neutrality. The United States wants to stay out of the conflict. They do not want to get entangled in a European war. The U.S. doesn't see the advantage of going to war. While it is a global conflict, the United States doesn't want to be involved in a land war in Europe. President Wilson declares that every man who really loves America will act and speak in the true spirit of neutrality. And Wilson declares that they will have peace without victory. What that means is that they do not need victory. They will maintain peace and they will be able to keep going. Americans actually really embrace this idea of neutrality. They do not see the point of going across the Atlantic and getting involved in a war that they didn't start, that is about these alliances. In 1916, race for the White House, Woodrow Wilson ran on a platform that said, keep us out of the war. You can see that depiction here. There's war in Europe, but there's peace in America. God bless Wilson. Wilson wins the presidency on this idea. However, much the public wanted to stay out of it, there would eventually be a move towards war. America could not stay neutral. While there was no direct threat to America, there were several factors that will eventually pull Americans into the war. And you can see the depiction here of Uncle Sam standing with Britannia. And this is kind of the idea that we had a lot of ties with Britain, but there's also other factors that went into drawing America into the war. So the United States ties with Great Britain are really one of the main reasons that they get involved in the war. The United States has economic and cultural ties with Great Britain that caused Americans to become critical of Germany as the war drags on. After war is declared in 1914, trade with Britain triples over the next several years. But trade with Germany decreases by 90%. So you can see those economic ties really going even further in Britain's way. So the United States is sending a lot of food, a lot of economic goods to Europe, particularly Great Britain, which is making its way to fuel the war. So Germany declares submarine warfare on armed merchant ships in the Atlantic Ocean in 1915. So Germany sinks 90 passenger and merchant ships in the winter and spring of 1915. In 1915, they sink a passenger ship known as the Lusitania. In that attack, 1,200 passengers died, including 128 Americans. And this will later be used as a rallying call for war against Germany. However, as a result of this, Germany issues the Sussex Pledge, which basically is issued in 1916, which basically says that Germany will attack armed merchant ships, but they will not attack passenger liners. However, Germany revokes the Sussex Pledge in January of 1917. They basically say we are going to declare unrestricted warfare on any ship coming into the Northern Atlantic coming, trying to get goods, trying to get people into Great Britain, into Europe. And they also issue what is known as the Zimmermann Telegram. This is a communication from Germany to Mexico, trying to make an alliance with Mexico in the event of war with the United States. So what the Zimmermann Telegram says is, we make Mexico an offer of alliance, make war together, make peace together. Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So what Germany is saying is, join us in a fight against America, and you will win back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as a result. This telegram is intercepted by the United States and deeply upsets people. They see Germany interfering, trying to get their neighbors involved in a war against them. So these factors, the United States' economic ties with Great Britain, the sinking of the Lusitania and unrestricted submarine warfare, and the Zimmermann Telegram lead the United States to declare war on Germany in 1917. And this will really change the tide of war for all the powers involved. So part of the reason that the Americans were willing to enter the war was really an idealistic view of what was happening. Americans saw the war as a fight against evil and authoritarian government. The German Empire was ruled over by a single man, the Tsar, Tsar Kaiser Wilhelm II. And President Wilson was actually convinced the U.S. That if they were to join, they could make the world safe for democracy. They could overthrow this authoritative government and open up the world to democracy. So Wilson uses that euphemism as a war to end all wars, and the idea if they overthrow that authoritative government in Germany, they could open up the world to democracy. And what you see here too is a depiction from a American propaganda, basically showing the idea that the Germans are different. They're Huns, going back to Attila the Hun and enemies in the East. So this is really the kind of idealistic aspect of the First World War from the American point of view. America joined the war effort in April of 1917, and they quickly raised a huge army. When war broke out, there was about 120,000 servicemen in the United States Army. Within a year, that army would go to 4 million men. So the army rate grows massively in size as they start this war effort and go to Europe to fight the war. In the course of fighting, over 18 months, 117,000 American doughboys died in World War I. The American soldiers were referred to as doughboys. There's a variety of ideas of why they got that nickname, but that was what they were referred to. So it was a huge war effort to raise this many people, and it was a huge loss for the Americans. Part of the reason they were able to raise such a large army was the passage of the Selected Service Act in 1917. This act allowed the federal government to raise the national army for service in World War I through conscription, through drafting. So the act required that men over the age of 18 had to sign up, and they could be elected or selected to go to war. This is still a law today. Once you turn the age of 18, you have to sign up for the selective service in case this happens. And you can see that depiction here in these two recruitment posters for the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy. The idea is they were trying to draw people in, but it was also required by law. The U.S. government also started a massive propaganda campaign to support men signing up for war, but also for people to support the war effort throughout the country. So you can see that depicted here in these propaganda posters. The one on the left said, "Destroy this mad brute." You can see a depiction of a brutish ape-like figure depicted as a German carrying away Lady Liberty and in asking people to enlist. Then you see the depiction here of, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" Basically kind of pulling at men to go, what did you do? What are you doing? Get out there and help. So with all the men going to war, the home front, the area in the United States, not in Europe, they needed more workers. So they really reached out to women to fill a lot of this void. You can see that depiction here with the woman fitting gas masks, creating gas masks. And you see this national campaign for the Salvation Army. Women served as nurses, helped out wounded soldiers, other people at home. So they would really mobilize the idea that women could be part of the war effort, if not fighting the war. So again, the United States entered World War I in a lot of ways for a very idealistic and humanitarian way. You can see that depicted in these two propaganda posters here. You can see the one on the left says, "Don't let them die. You can save them." You can see a woman holding one child who appears to be dead. Another one's clutching onto her. You can see the wasteland of Europe. And the idea here is send contributions of women's apparel. Help out, give them clothes. Volunteer to help out. And then the other one is a depiction. It says, "Remember Belgium, buy war bonds." So help the effort. And you could see here the depiction of a massive German soldier leading looks like a woman through flames. And the idea is that, the Germans went through Belgium. We have to remember that. They went through and destroyed Belgium. We have to defend these people. All of this propaganda was created by the Committee on Public Information. This was a committee created during the war. And the idea there was to spread the propaganda, try to spread the idea that the war needed to be fought. And you can see another depiction here, "Wake Up America, civilization calls, every man, woman, and child." You can see that moral call to war. So America is really trying to change public opinion, trying to influence the public greatly. But they're also creating measures to try to limit people from opposing the war. So in 1917, the Espionage and Sedition Act was passed, which limited freedom of speech in opposition to the war. It made it difficult for people to stand out against the war. And this really, took away some of those freedoms that were guaranteed in the Constitution. This was actually held up in the case of Schenck versus the U.S. In this case, Charles Schenck was a member of the Socialist Party and had been spreading propaganda, basically opposing the war, and was arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Act. And the Supreme Court upheld the ruling and said that the First Amendment rights could be restricted if the words spoken or printed represented to society a clear and present danger. So the idea there is that, the American government is restricting some rights of the people in their war effort. The government also defended people who violently attacked people of German heritage. That happened in the case of John Mintz. Here you can see Mintz's picture here. He was attacked by a mob because of his German heritage. He was kidnapped, tarred and feathered, and almost lynched. After this event, which is a horrific event, you can see the aftermath there of the feathers stuck to him. He sued 32 men. However, the state found in favor of the defendants. They ruled in favor of the defendants, basically saying that it's all right. He has German heritage. They didn't do anything too bad. An even more tragic case is the case of Robert Prager. Prager was a German American who had actually tried to enlist in the U.S. Navy. He was lynched by a 500-person mob for simply being a German. A jury acquitted the men who killed him after just 20 minutes of deliberation. The jury claimed that this was a patriotic murder, that they were just defending America, that they brought the war home. And then one of the defendants said after the trial, "Well, I guess nobody can say that we're not loyal now," basically meaning we're loyal to the United States. We killed a German, even if he was an American. So you can really see the horrors of war coming home and the way that people actually defended this, the government and juries. It took a lot of effort to supply the men and to supply the war effort as they were fighting. So you can see that depiction here in this. It said, "I need smokes more than anything else. Send over cigarettes. That's what the men need. And then help her fill a pipe for a fighting man in France. Send money so that we can get tobacco to him." The idea is not just like bullets and bandages. We need food. We need tobacco. So one of the ways that the United States raised money for the war was through war bonds and a program known as the Liberty Loans. World War One ended up costing the United States $35.5 billion. That is a massive amount of money during that time. But to raise money, the U.S. issued war bonds. They also issued the Liberty Loan campaigns. So the U.S. conducted 5 Liberty Loan campaigns that raised $21 billion. So these were campaigns where the United States would ask for money and basically give you government bonds, so later you could get back your money with interest. The U.S. also raised taxes and went into debt as a result of the war. So it was a huge effort. Here you can see propaganda depictions of the Victory Loan program. You can see the propaganda saying that, and they thought we couldn't fight, basically saying, like, you see the depiction here, "Hey, you guys helped us out. We went over." You can see the guy bandaged up, but he's got German helmets. He went over there and raised hell in Europe. And then you can see the depiction here of "For Home and Country." Give money so we can bring our boys back home, bring our men back home. A food administration was created in the war effort to try to save food, to try to send food over. So it was really a total war effort. It's happening in Europe, but it's also the people in the United States are sacrificing as well. So you see these depictions here: food will win the war. Little Americans, do your bite. Eat different things, save wheat for soldiers. The idea here is waste nothing, leave nothing on your plate. You can see that. Send that to Europe, give that to our troops. Children were also called on through these propaganda campaigns to contribute to the war effort. You can see that depiction here. The Boy Scouts of America helping out the Liberty Loan campaign there on the left. And then you can see here it says 20 sheep to equip and clothe each soldier. Boys and girls can help join a sheep club. The idea is here, let's go shear some sheep to make some clothing for soldiers. Boys and girls can come out and help the war effort as well. So this massive um, effort and massive amount of men going to Europe really tipped the scales between the Allies and Germany, where they'd been stuck in a stalemate in trench warfare. The United States, with all their men, with all their money, with all the supplies, came over and they were able to defeat the Germans with the help of the Allies. And the Germans surrendered in November of 1918. So what this really shows is that America's effort to raise men to fight at the home front, with women involved, with children involved, with supplies, that America could really be a major military power and could have major influences on conflicts going forward.